And I'm very glad I did, because actually if I'd finished my degree, by the time I'd have finished the degree, I would have got rid of this, it would have gone.
In a move that stunned industry insiders and American workers alike, Freightliner, one of the most iconic names in American heavy-duty truck manufacturing, quietly exited the U.S. market. The company's departure wasn't marked by a farewell ceremony or a press release celebrating decades of domestic production. Instead, it came like a thunderclap. One day, factories were humming. The next, thousands of jobs were gone. Billions of dollars in economic activity vanished, and entire communities were left to pick up the pieces. This wasn't just another corporate relocation. It was a seismic event that rattled the very core of what Made in America used to mean. And the warning signs were there, buried beneath layers of policy decisions, supply chain vulnerabilities, and corporate strategy. Freightliner's decision to pull the plug was the climax of a long-simmering problem that had been years in the making, but few truly saw it coming. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now on to the video. What makes this exit particularly jarring is Freightliner's reputation. Known for producing dependable, high-performance trucks used across construction, logistics, and agriculture, Freightliner had long been a pillar of American industrial might. Its manufacturing plants in places like North Carolina and South Carolina weren't just production centers, they were economic engines, deeply embedded in the lives and identities of the communities they served. So why would a company so entrenched in American soil suddenly uproot itself? The answer, in part, lies in a set of tariffs that were meant to do the exact opposite of what they caused. The Trump administration's tariffs on imported steel and aluminum were framed as a bold step toward revitalizing American manufacturing. By taxing foreign materials, the policy aimed to level the playing field for U.S. manufacturers. But for companies like Freightliner, which depend on vast quantities of steel and aluminum to build their vehicles, the tariffs were anything but helpful. The cost of raw materials surged by nearly 30%. Overnight, supply chains were thrown into disarray. Prices for essential components fluctuated wildly. Predictability, the bedrock of any efficient manufacturing operation, evaporated. Shareholders became restless and executives began to panic. For Freightliner, the economic math was unforgiving. Continuing production in the U.S. meant either passing higher costs onto consumers, slashing margins to near zero, or absorbing massive losses. And so, the decision was made. Behind closed doors, operations began shifting overseas. It wasn't a decision taken lightly, but it was made decisively. And in the company's view, necessarily. Freightliner's leadership cited survival as their primary motivator. Stay in the U.S., and they risked bankruptcy. Leave, and they could remain competitive on the global stage. Still, that explanation did little to soothe the anger and heartbreak of the workers who showed up one morning to find their jobs eliminated. Nor did it calm the fury of community leaders who had championed the company for decades, nor the small business owners whose livelihoods depended on the foot traffic from Freightliner's workforce. The optics were undeniably painful. Here was an American industrial giant, founded and nurtured on American soil, turning its back on the very people who had made it successful. Social media erupted. Politicians pointed fingers. Editorials lamented the end of an era. But Freightliner's exit is not just a story about tariffs, trade, or corporate greed. It's a story about fragility. The fragility of American manufacturing, of community identity, and of the assumptions that hard work and loyalty would always be rewarded. Freightliner's departure laid bare a troubling truth, that even the most deeply rooted companies can be uprooted in an instant when the economic winds shift. This is more than a story about trucks. It's a story about America, what it was, what it's becoming, and what it stands to lose if this trend continues. And as Freightliner's gates closed for the final time, a much bigger question opened: who's next? The economic landscape shifted dramatically in 2018 when the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. Billed as a patriotic move to revive American industry and protect domestic jobs, these tariffs added a 25% tax on steel and 10% on aluminum imported into the U.S. The intended effect? Make foreign materials more expensive, prompting American companies to buy domestic. The actual result? A widespread shockwave that devastated the very manufacturers those tariffs were meant to protect. Freightliner was one of the earliest casualties. As a company heavily reliant on large quantities of steel and aluminum to manufacture its heavy-duty trucks, the sudden spike in raw material cost was catastrophic. Overnight, Freightliner found itself paying 25-30% more for materials that previously made up a significant portion of its production costs. That's not a small uptick. It's the kind of jump that can obliterate profit margins. And Freightliner wasn't alone. Across the board, U.S.-based manufacturers struggled to absorb the cost increases. Suppliers began to waver. Contracts were delayed. Orders were canceled. The cost of building a single truck surged by thousands of dollars. In the words of one industry analyst, the math stopped working. It wasn't just the materials that posed a problem. The tariffs introduced chaos into global supply chains. Many U.S. manufacturers, including Freightliner, sourced not only raw materials but also specialized components from countries now affected by the tariffs. This created logistical nightmares. Delays at ports, customs complications, and fluctuating pricing turned what was once a lean, efficient production model into a ticking time bomb. Even worse, while Freightliner and its peers were shouldering these rising costs, foreign competitors in Asia and Europe faced no such burdens. In fact, many international manufacturers gained a competitive edge, offering lower prices while U.S. firms struggled to keep up. Ironically, a policy designed to make American products more attractive globally did the opposite. It pushed some of America's biggest names out of the game entirely. Internally, Freightliner's leadership faced a grim choice: continue absorbing losses in the name of loyalty to domestic manufacturing, or relocate and survive. The decision was framed as reluctant but necessary. Executives pointed to shareholder pressure, spiraling costs, and a hostile trade environment. Publicly, they cited economics. Privately, the tone was more severe: adapt or perish. For many Americans, this moment marked a bitter realization. The policies that had been advertised as a revival strategy were turning into an unintentional execution order for the manufacturing sector. As factories closed and jobs disappeared, union leaders, economists, and even some lawmakers began to admit the uncomfortable truth. The tariffs had backfired. A senior economist at a Washington think tank put it bluntly: "You can't wall off an economy in a globalized world without consequences. The tariffs tried to protect American jobs, but they ended up strangling the supply chains those jobs depended on." The damage was visible, not just in Freightliner's exit, but in the hesitations of other companies. Ford paused investment in new domestic facilities. Harley-Davidson moved production of certain motorcycles overseas. Boeing began exploring overseas partnerships to hedge against supply instability. The result? An erosion of confidence in America's manufacturing future. And that growing unease didn't stay behind closed doors. It exploded into the public sphere. And it wasn't long before Freightliner's decision sparked a political firestorm the White House couldn't ignore. Freightliner's departure was not an isolated incident. It was the first domino in what quickly became a cascading crisis across the American manufacturing sector. And once that first piece fell, the rest followed with alarming speed. Industry observers were quick to note the immediate reaction from other manufacturers. In boardrooms across the country, executives saw Freightliner's move not as betrayal, but as a warning. If a well-established, deeply rooted company like Freightliner could no longer afford to operate in the U.S., what hope did smaller or less diversified firms have? The signs of a broader exodus were already beginning to show. Harley-Davidson, another iconic American brand, had faced similar pressures. Even before Freightliner made its move, Harley had started shifting some production to Thailand, citing the same reasons: tariff costs, global competitiveness, and uncertain supply chains. After Freightliner's exit, Harley accelerated its relocation plans. Ford, one of the pillars of the American automotive industry, also took notice. Though the company maintained a public stance of commitment to U.S. jobs, insiders revealed that Ford was actively expanding operations in Mexico and reevaluating future U.S.-based investments. The goal? Cost efficiency, plain and simple. Even Boeing, a company with deep ties to American aerospace manufacturing, began diversifying its international footprint. Faced with increased costs on imported aerospace components and supply disruptions, Boeing quietly inked deals with overseas partners to insulate its operations from further tariff shocks. What connected all these decisions was a growing consensus. The cost of doing business in the U.S. had become unpredictable and, in many cases, unsustainable. While American policymakers debated protectionist measures, global competitors were capitalizing on the opportunity. Germany offered manufacturing tax credits. India rolled out aggressive industrial incentives. China, often the target of U.S. trade policy, opened new special economic zones with promises of low-cost labor, high-tech infrastructure, and government subsidies. The message from abroad was clear. We want your business. American executives listened. As more companies considered overseas options, the structure of domestic manufacturing began to erode. Suppliers who relied on Freightliner's orders saw cascading cancellations. Trucking firms lost contracts. Local contractors, logistics services, and tech vendors who supported manufacturing ecosystems were suddenly scrambling for clients. What's more, the symbolic weight of Freightliner's decision was immense. It was a psychological shift. If Freightliner could leave, the company that had long been a cornerstone of American made, then no one was safe. The term reshoring, which once filled headlines with optimism, was now replaced by a colder phrase, strategic withdrawal. And with uncertainty spreading fast, attention turned to Washington, where lawmakers found themselves in the eye of a political storm. The political fallout from Freightliner's departure was immediate and explosive. What had started as a quiet exit strategy quickly transformed into a national controversy. The very policies that were supposed to bring jobs back home were now under fire for driving them away. At the center of the storm was the Trump administration's tariff plan, once hailed as a bold, pro-American strategy. Now, it was being criticized from both sides of the aisle. Supporters of the administration scrambled to defend the tariffs, arguing that companies like Freightliner were exploiting the situation. This isn't about policy, one conservative lawmaker insisted. It's about greed. Freightliner saw an opportunity to cut costs and jumped ship. That's not patriotism, it's profiteering. But critics pointed to a different reality. They argued that the administration had fundamentally misunderstood the complexity of modern supply chains. By disrupting global material flows and inflating costs, the tariffs had cornered American manufacturers, forcing them to make painful decisions. "We built a trap," said one Democratic senator, "and we walked right into it." Meanwhile, labor unions erupted in protest. In towns like Gaffney, South Carolina, where Freightliner had once been the largest employer, rallies drew thousands. Chants of "Bring our jobs back" echoed through shuttered factory gates. Union leaders condemned both the company and the policies that enabled its departure. The outrage wasn't limited to political circles. On social media, the backlash was fierce. Hashtags like #manufacturing-exodus and #tariff-trap began trending. Viral videos showed laid-off workers packing up their lockers. Former employees shared emotional stories of loss, betrayal, and uncertainty. In Congress, the pressure mounted. Lawmakers demanded hearings. Freightliner's CEO was summoned to testify. Community leaders, economists, and workers lined up to speak on the record. Their message was consistent. America's industrial base was collapsing, and no one seemed to have a plan to stop it. Behind closed doors, panic set in. The administration that had once promised to bring manufacturing back now faced the reality that their signature economic policy might be doing the exact opposite. Calls for a new strategy grew louder. Some pushed for targeted subsidies. Others demanded a complete rollback of tariffs. And while the political class argued, the economic damage was already spreading. Because while politicians debated the fate of trade policy, everyday Americans were confronting a different kind of fallout, one that couldn't be solved with rhetoric. When Freightliner shuttered its U.S. operations, the blow wasn't just felt in corporate earnings reports or economic forecasts, it was felt in the homes, streets, and schools of ordinary Americans who suddenly found themselves without a livelihood. Take David Martinez, a 53-year-old machine operator from North Carolina. For 25 years, he clocked in at Freightliner's plant at 6 a.m. sharp, just like his father did before him. For David, Freightliner wasn't just an employer, it was a legacy. He had even hoped to pass it on to his son, but all of that vanished with a single announcement. When I got the call, I thought it was a mistake, David said. You give half your life to a company, you think there's some security in that. Turns out, there isn't. David's story is far from unique. Across towns that once thrived on industrial stability, workers faced a cruel reality. Loyalty doesn't guarantee security anymore. The economic aftershocks were immediate. Thousands of jobs evaporated overnight. Health insurance? Gone. Pension plans? Frozen. Retirement dreams? Delayed indefinitely. In the weeks following the closure, local officials tried to respond. Job fairs were organized. Vocational training programs were launched. But for many of Freightliner's former employees, now in their 50s or early 60s, restarting a career was a daunting proposition. We've got decades of experience, Viton, said Linda, a skilled welder from the South Carolina plant. But then it's not experience anyone's hiring for anymore. And for those trying to pivot, it wasn't just about skills, it was about identity. These weren't just workers. They were craftsmen, engineers, technicians. They built something real. To suddenly be told those skills were obsolete was as demoralizing as it was destabilizing. Beyond the economic loss, there was an emotional toll. A sense of betrayal permeated the workforce. These employees weren't asking for handouts. They had invested decades of labor under the assumption that the company would stand by them, just as they had stood by the company. Instead, they were discarded. One worker described it as a divorce without warning. One day we were partners. The next day I was cut off. No thank you. No closure. Just gone. And with the workforce gutted, the ripple effects began to spread far beyond Freightliner's factory gates, because this wasn't just about jobs. It was about communities, families, and futures built on a promise that no longer existed. In small towns across the Carolinas, Freightliner wasn't just a company, it was the beating heart of the local economy. And when that heart stopped, everything else followed. Gaffney, South Carolina, offers a stark example. Before the closure, Freightliner's factory was the town's largest employer. Hundreds of families relied on its wages to pay mortgages, send kids to school, and keep local businesses afloat. But after the closure, that economic lifeline snapped, and the entire community began to unravel. Pauline's Cafe, a family-run diner just 2 blocks from the factory, saw its foot traffic cut in half in less than a month. The waitresses, many of whom had served regulars for years, stood around empty tables. The owner, Mary Perkins, wiped down a spotless counter and said, "We've been here since the plant opened. Now they're gone, and we're probably next." Mary wasn't being dramatic. Hardware stores, auto shops, barber shops, businesses that had survived recessions and weathered tough times were now closing their doors for good. The local high school, which had once boasted cutting-edge manufacturing classes and robotics programs funded through local taxes, faced budget cuts. Teachers were laid off. Programs were canceled. Even the housing market couldn't escape. Property values near the factory plummeted. For sale signs multiplied, and many homeowners suddenly found themselves underwater, owing more on their homes than they were worth. The collapse was cultural as much as it was financial. Town halls filled with anxious residents looking for answers. Some blamed the company, others pointed fingers at the government, but most simply asked, "What happens to us now?" Meanwhile, neighboring towns began bracing for impact. Rumors of additional plant closures sparked fear and uncertainty. Families stopped spending. High school graduates who once dreamed of joining the workforce now looked out of state or out of country for opportunities. What was happening wasn't just a local downturn. It was a domino collapse of an ecosystem built on the promise of stable, long-term employment. And the most painful part, there was no villain in sight. No scandal, no mismanagement, just a strategic business decision that wiped out entire neighborhoods. But as devastating as the economic collapse was, it opened up a deeper wound, one that struck at the heart of American identity. The shutdown of Freightliner's U.S. operations wasn't just a hit to the economy, it was a cultural rupture. In many ways, it marked the end of a shared American story, one where factory jobs promised not just income, but dignity, identity, and generational continuity. For decades, the phrase "Made in America" stood for something: quality, toughness, reliability. Products built on U.S. soil weren't just items, they were symbols of resilience and craftsmanship. Workers at Freightliner wore that badge with pride. Generations of families built their lives around those values. But when the company left, it wasn't just jobs that vanished. It was pride. "It felt like we lost who we were," said Michael, a third-generation machinist. "My grandfather wore his Freightliner jacket like a medal. My dad worked weekends so I could go to college. Now I wonder if any of it meant anything." His story is echoed in towns across the manufacturing belt. Kids who grew up idolizing their parents' blue-collar work ethic are now disillusioned. The factories that once represented stability now stand as symbols of risk. Even language began to shift. Where once loyalty and commitment defined the workforce, now words like betrayal and disposable are whispered across union halls and lunch counters. Cultural historians have taken note. One noted, "This isn't just economic trauma. It's cultural grief. These workers believed in the American promise, and now they're questioning its very foundation." The breakdown of trust runs deep. Worker unions that once rallied members with chants of solidarity now struggle to get attendance. "What's the point of fighting?" one worker asked, "if we can all be tossed aside tomorrow?" And the damage isn't confined to Freightliner towns. Across America, manufacturing workers in similar industries are asking tough questions. Are we next? Is there a future for skilled labor in this country? What happened to the social contract that once bound employer and employee? As faith in the manufacturing system falters, the national narrative begins to shift. Once the factory floor was a place of honor. Now it's a cautionary tale. But while American workers mourned the loss of something sacred, the rest of the world watched and moved in to claim the ground America left behind. As America watched its manufacturing backbone buckle, global competitors seized the opportunity. Freightliner's exit wasn't simply a retreat, it was a vacuum. And in the world of international trade and industry, a vacuum never stays empty for long. Within weeks of Freightliner's departure, nations around the world began signaling that they were ready, eager even to take America's place as the new hub for heavy-duty truck production. Chief among them? China. Beijing moved swiftly. Freightliner executives were reportedly approached with a package of incentives: tax breaks, expedited permits, streamlined regulations, and priority access to China's expansive export networks. In return, Freightliner would relocate core manufacturing to a newly developed industrial zone in Zhejiang province, strategically positioned near ports, suppliers, and infrastructure ready to support mass production. The benefits were undeniable. Freightliner could avoid U.S. tariffs, slash labor costs, and tap into China's increasingly sophisticated supply chains. It was a no-brainer for the bottom line, and a punch in the gut for American workers. But China wasn't alone. India stepped up as well. With an eye on expanding its manufacturing base, India's government pitched its Make in India initiative. Freightliner was offered access to low-cost industrial zones, a skilled but underutilized labor force, and favorable terms for import-export. India was betting that by attracting just one or two major U.S. companies, they could spark a cascading effect. And early signs suggested the gamble might pay off. The European Union entered the fray too. Countries like Poland and Germany touted their stability, proximity to lucrative Western markets, and advanced manufacturing capabilities. Freightliner's potential move to a new European base was not only feasible, it was seen as strategically smart. Germany offered green subsidies for environmentally friendly truck production, something Freightliner was already exploring. And then there was South Korea. With its tight-knit industrial ecosystems and reputation for efficiency, Korean firms made overtures to Freightliner for joint ventures and shared facilities. In an ironic twist, many of these nations had once looked to the U.S. as the model for industrial development. Now they were offering themselves as the superior alternative. The global chessboard was shifting. What these moves highlighted was a broader truth. While America's policies were driving manufacturers away, other nations were evolving to accommodate them. They weren't just welcoming U.S. companies, they were building new ecosystems around them, integrating automation, sustainability, and modern infrastructure in ways that the U.S. had failed to match. Freightliner's exit sent a message far louder than any speech or tariff. America is no longer the most business-friendly environment for manufacturing. And it wasn't just a corporate decision. It was a global signal, one that America's rivals were all too happy to receive. But this international shift sparked outrage back home, not just economically, but morally. Because beneath the strategic calculus, people were beginning to ask, when profit dictates loyalty, who really pays the price? As Freightliner packed up its plants and moved abroad, a new wave of questions swept across the U.S. Not just about economics, but about ethics. Is it acceptable for a company that has received billions in government subsidies, tax incentives, and community support to simply abandon the very workers and towns that built it? The debate was fiery and immediate. Public trust, already frayed, took a direct hit. Americans weren't just angry about job losses, they felt betrayed. For decades, they had been told that hard work, loyalty, and domestic investment would be rewarded, that if you gave your best years to a company, it would take care of you. Now, that promise looked like a lie. Consumer advocacy groups sprang into action. They argued that companies receiving federal support should be legally obligated to maintain domestic production for a minimum number of years. If we're going to write you checks, one advocate said, you don't get to cash them and leave the country. Some lawmakers proposed legislation that would claw back federal subsidies from companies that relocated within 5 years of receiving them. Others floated the idea of patriotic incentives, federal benefits tied to long-term domestic hiring, community reinvestment, and supply chain transparency. At the center of the storm was Freightliner's once pristine brand image. For decades, the company had been synonymous with rugged reliability, American grit, and trust. Now, it was being rebranded by critics as a corporate deserter. Profitable, yes, but no longer principled. Shareholders, too, began to feel the heat. While stock prices remained steady in the short term, brand loyalty took a serious hit. Fleet operators voiced concern over the company's commitment to stability. If they can shift production on a whim, one trucking company executive asked, what guarantees do we have they'll even honor their support warranties 5 years from now? But not everyone was convinced the outrage was fair. Some economists warned that punishing companies for making rational financial decisions would only accelerate their departure. You can't legislate loyalty, one analyst said. You have to make it economically attractive to stay. That may be true, but the damage was already done. For many communities, the scars left by Freightliner's departure weren't just economic. They were psychological. Workers who had once believed in a mutual contract with their employer now felt disillusioned. The idea that corporate America owed something, anything, to the people it employed was under attack. And this wasn't just about Freightliner. It was about a larger reckoning with capitalism in a globalized world. Can corporations serve both shareholders and citizens? Should the pursuit of profit be bound by patriotism? And if not, what's to stop every major manufacturer from following Freightliner's lead? Those are the questions America is still struggling to answer. But while the moral debate rages on, a more urgent question looms. Can America rebuild what it's lost? And more importantly, can it do so in time? Rebuilding American manufacturing won't come easy. It won't happen through slogans or tariffs alone. If the Freightliner crisis has taught us anything, it's that survival in a global economy demands more than flag waving. It demands innovation, flexibility, and forward-thinking strategy. One of the clearest examples of a possible path forward is Tesla. At its Gigafactory in Texas, Tesla is proving that domestic manufacturing isn't just possible. It can be profitable. Designed from the ground up with automation, AI integration, and renewable energy sources, the factory sets a new bar for what 21st century manufacturing can look like. It's lean, it's fast, and it's resilient against the same supply chain shocks that crippled Freightliner. Tesla's model demonstrates the potential of modern industrial ecosystems. By automating repetitive tasks, costs go down while quality remains high. By integrating solar and wind power, operational expenses drop and carbon footprints shrink. By designing for modular production, Tesla adapts quickly without the need to uproot. This isn't just about electric cars, it's about building smarter. The US government has started to take notice. Policymakers are now considering a new set of incentives, grants for sustainable factories, tax breaks for companies that reshore production, and federal support for advanced workforce training. Education will be critical. Community colleges and trade schools are rapidly updating curriculums to include robotics, data-driven manufacturing, and green engineering. The goal? Equip the next generation of American workers with the tools they need, not just for jobs that used to exist, but for the ones that will. If there's a silver lining to the Freightliner crisis, it's this. It exposed the cracks in the system. And now the country has a chance to rebuild better. But it won't happen without difficult conversations and collective willpower. It won't happen unless corporate leaders, policymakers, and workers come together to rethink what American manufacturing should be in a new age.
Because the real question isn't just, can we bring the jobs back? It's, can we build a system that's too smart and too valuable to ever abandon again? Freightliner's exit from the United States wasn't just about one company chasing cheaper production costs. It was about something much deeper. Something that struck at the heart of American identity, economics, and the fragile trust between corporations, workers, and the government. It was a reminder that the system we've relied on for decades is no longer as unshakable as we once believed. For many Americans, the Freightliner story is personal. It's about lost jobs, broken routines, and factories that once symbolized stability, now sitting silent and empty. It's about fathers and mothers who spent 30 years on the assembly line, only to watch everything they built vanish overnight. It's about small towns losing their soul, not just their main source of employment, but their sense of purpose. But this isn't just about the past. It's about the future we're hurtling toward, and whether we'll make the bold decisions required to shape it or continue watching it unravel in slow motion. Let's be clear. Freightliner didn't collapse. It didn't go bankrupt. It moved. It made a strategic, calculated decision to shift operations to countries offering more favorable conditions, better margins, smoother supply chains, fewer regulatory headaches, and access to cheaper labor. From a corporate perspective, it made perfect sense. But from a national perspective, it was a disaster. This departure shined a spotlight on the cracks in America's industrial policy. For too long, we've relied on outdated systems and short-term fixes. Tariffs were supposed to bring jobs back. Instead, they drove companies out. Subsidies were supposed to keep companies grounded. Instead, they were handed out with little accountability and no long-term requirements. We kept trying to patch the boat, but we ignored the rising tide. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.